This episode of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast is sponsored in part by Law Enforcement Labor Services in Minnesota.
Law Enforcement Labor Services, also known as LELS, is Minnesota's largest public safety labor union, with over 7,000 Minnesota public safety members serving in all areas of public safety. Law enforcement, 911 dispatch centers, corrections, public safety administrative support personnel, and firefighters. Established in 1977, LELS serves over 260 different public safety agencies and over 450 locals across the state of Minnesota. With their administration, general counsel, 3 staff attorneys, and 14 business agents, LELS provides contract negotiations for better wages and benefits, grievance processing and representation, discipline representation, mediation and arbitration, assistance with representation for post-board hearings, and in-line of duty death benefits for survivor families. Find out more about Law Enforcement Labor Services at LELS.org. LELS.org.
Episodes of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast may contain strong language and violent content. Listener discretion is advised.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Sheriff Scott Rose from Minnesota, and I'm your host for today's new episode of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast.
Walking eastbound.
In each episode of the Officer Down Memorial Podcast, we'll share the details and the stories of how these men and women heroically lost their lives in the line of duty. Our mission is to help ensure their service and sacrifice is never forgotten. Thanks for spending some time with me today to remember and honor these fallen heroes. It had been just about a year since the stock market had crashed, plunging the nation into what would become the Great Depression. Across the country, businesses were closing, banks were failing, and families were wondering what the future might hold as hard times settled over communities large and small. In Texas, 2 young people had recently met and begun a relationship that would eventually become the stuff of legends. Their names were Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, and in 1930 they were largely unknown, but within a few short years later, they would launch one of the most infamous crime sprees in American history, capturing headlines across the nation during the Depression era.
From New York City comes word that work continues at a remarkable pace on what promises to be the tallest building ever constructed by the hand of man. Hundreds of feet above the streets of Manhattan, crews of ironworkers and builders labor day and night to complete the Empire State Building, an engineering marvel that will soon tower over every structure on Earth. Despite the difficult economic times facing our nation, this great skyscraper stands as a symbol of American industry.
It was a time of uncertainty, of change, and of contrasts. America was building skyward, struggling economically, and witnessing the beginnings of stories that would become part of history. Yet, far from the bright lights of New York City and the headlines of the nation's newspapers, another story was unfolding in a remote border county of northern Minnesota, one that would end in tragedy, but whose legacy would endure for generations. The year was 1930. It was late August along Minnesota's northern border. Summer was beginning to slowly transition towards autumn. The dense forests surrounding the rainy river and the small communities scattered along the Canadian border remained lush and green, but there was already a subtle hint that the seasons were beginning to change. The long days of summer were growing shorter. Warm afternoons often climbed into the 70s, while cool evenings sent residents reaching for light jackets as the sun disappeared behind the pine-covered horizon. Fishing boats dotted Rainy Lake, tourists still arrived by rail and steamer to enjoy the wilderness, and farmers throughout the region worked to bring in hay and prepare for the coming harvest. The resorts and lodges that lined the lakes remained busy, squeezing every last week they could from the summer season before Labor Day signaled its official end. In these remote border communities, the Canadian National Railway served as a vital lifeline. Its passenger trains carried tourists, businessmen, immigrants, customs officials, and local residents back and forth across the international boundary every day. The rhythmic sound of locomotives echoing through the forests were as familiar as the call of a loon across the water in these parts of Minnesota. Few people traveling through the Rainy River country on that August day could have imagined that they were about to become witnesses to one of the most shocking acts of violence ever committed along this peaceful stretch of the Minnesota-Canadian border. It was late summer in northern Minnesota. Laurence Edward Doten boarded a Canadian National Railway passenger train near Emo, Ontario. Now, to understand what happened to Laurence Doten in 1930, you first have to understand the importance of the railroad. Today in the U.S., if you want to travel a few hundred miles, we jump into a car, you board an airplane, or you climb on a bus. But back in 1930, especially in the vast wilderness stretching across northern Minnesota and western Ontario, the railroad was king. The automobile back in 1930 was becoming more common, but many roads were still little more than gravel trails. Especially during the long northern winters, snow, mud, and isolation could make travel difficult or impossible. Commercial air travel was still in its infancy, and it was far beyond the reach of most Americans and Canadians. So the railroad connected everything. It carried families visiting relatives. It carried businessmen conducting trade, mail, newspapers, livestock, timber, ore, government officials, and law enforcement officers. Entire communities depended upon the arrival of the daily train. In many northern towns, the railroad station was the center of community life. For the border communities of Rainier, Minnesota, International Falls, Fort Francis, and the scattered settlements stretching westward towards Winnipeg, the Canadian National Railway served as a vital transportation artery. The steel rails crossed rivers, forests, muskegs, and countless miles of rugged wilderness, linking remote communities to major cities hundreds of miles away. The line wasn't just important to Canada, it was also important to the United States as well. Long before modern border crossings and interstate highways, the Canadian National Railway carried American travelers, government officials, and commerce through portions of Canada and back into the United States. The economies of northern Minnesota and western Ontario were deeply intertwined. Many families lived on one side of the border and worked on the other. Lumber, mining, agriculture, and tourism all relied on the movement of people and goods across the international boundary. For immigration inspectors like Laurence Doten and Laurence Jones, the trains themselves were part of the job. Rather than waiting at a fixed border crossing, inspectors often boarded trains and conducted inspections while the train was in motion. There, passenger manifests would be reviewed, travelers would be questioned, and customs and immigration laws were enforced miles from the nearest town. It was a routine part of border security in an era that thousands of people crossed between the United States and Canada by rail every day. Long before Laurence Doten patrolled the remote borderlands of northern Minnesota, he had already answered his nation's call to service on a battlefield half a world away. Like millions of young Americans of his generation, Doten came of age during one of the most turbulent periods in world history. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, he joined the U.S. Army and soon found himself bound for France. Assigned to Company L of the 131st Infantry Regiment, Doten became part of the American Expeditionary Forces that would help bring an end to one of the deadliest conflicts the world has ever known. The war he entered was unlike anything previous generations had ever experienced. Across the Western Front, massive armies faced one another from miles of trenches stretching across France and Belgium. Machine guns, artillery, poison gas, and relentless combat had transformed entire regions into scarred landscapes of mud, craters, and destruction. Laurence Doten would see much of that firsthand. Throughout 1918, Laurence participated in several major campaigns as American forces pushed alongside their Allied partners against the German army. He served near the Somme River, fought along the Albert Front, and took part in operations near Verdun, names that would become forever etched into military history. Then came the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. Launched in the fall of 1918, it was the largest military operation in American history up until that time. More than 1 million American soldiers would take part in this offensive that ultimately helped force Germany to seek an armistice and end the war. During the war, Laurence was wounded by enemy machine gun fire. Like so many members of the greatest generation, before that term even existed, Laurence carried on despite the hardships and dangers of combat. He survived the war and eventually returned home, joining countless veterans who attempted to rebuild their lives after witnessing the horrors of Europe. After the war, Laurence, still recovering from the wounds of war, took rehabilitation training at the University of Minnesota, where he received a Bachelor's of Science degree in agriculture, according to his granddaughter, Judy Wilson.
He had been retrained after he got back from all of his injury rehab and everything. They sent him to the U of M, and he was retrained as a teacher for agriculture and shop, and he taught. But anyway, it wasn't exciting enough for him. I think he got bored. And so he got on with immigration and wanted to do that instead.
For Laurence, service to his country did not end when he took off the Army uniform. In the years that followed, he would marry Clara Voxland in 1924, started a family, and continued a life dedicated to public service, becoming a United States immigration inspector in 1929. This career took him to the northern border of Minnesota, where he was one of the United States immigration inspectors charged with protecting the nation's frontiers on the passenger trains. The young soldier, who had once crossed the Atlantic to defend his country, would now serve it in a very different way, watching over the remote crossings, rail lines, and waterways that connected the United States and Canada. It was August 24th, 1930. For many families, the coming winter brought uncertainty as well as hardship. For United States Immigration Inspector Laurence Doten, however, it was just another workday. A decorated World War I veteran, a husband, and now father of 2 young children, Laurence was stationed in Rainier, where he helped patrol one of the busiest stretches of the international border. His duties routinely took him aboard trains crossing between Canada and the United States, checking passengers and protecting the nation's borders. On that evening, the passengers had settled into their seats as the locomotive's wheels rhythmically clicked across the rails. Outside, the windows stretched miles of forests, lakes, and wilderness. Inside, it appeared to be just another ordinary trip along one of North America's most important rail corridors. Soon, a routine trail ride through the remote wilderness along the Canadian border would erupt into violence near Emo, Ontario, and would honestly read more like a Hollywood crime thriller than a true story. Earlier that day, a 21-year-old drifter named Emmerich Frenette had escaped authorities in Fort Frances, Ontario. Now, police had attempted to arrest him for theft, but Frenette managed to flee and board a western-bound passenger train. Unknown to the crew, the passengers, and inspectors Doten and Jones, the fugitive was armed. He was desperate, and he was on the run. As the train rolled through the darkness, Frenette encountered immigration inspectors Laurence Doten and Laurence Jones from Minnesota. Investigators believed Frenette mistook the 2 inspectors for police officers pursuing him. The confrontation would turn deadly. Train conductor George Ireland would later recount the terrifying events of that night. He found himself face to face with Frenette in a vestibule between 2 passenger coaches. "I've just killed 1 man," Frenette warned him, "and if you don't do as I say, you will be the second." Dangling from Frenette's wrists was a handcuff. a silent reminder of the rest that he had escaped only hours earlier. According to conductor Ireland, Frenette said that he wanted to go to Winnipeg, and he ordered Ireland into the day coach, where there were quite a few passengers sleeping. After getting Ireland to roll a cigarette for him, Frenette sat down just a few seats away from Ireland and faced him. Laurence Doten was sitting on the opposite side, and at some point, he stood up and stretched in his seat, immediately getting the attention of Frenette. Unfortunately, Laurence likely had no idea what was going on until Frenette stood up and shot him without warning. Laurence immediately went down. The gunman then took Ireland to the vestibule of another coach. At that point, Inspector Jones appeared at the entrance of that coach and asked where Doten was. Ireland was so scared he couldn't speak. Then, once again, Frenette, without warning, shot Jones, who also went down. By this time, panic had spread throughout the train. Passengers scrambled for safety as trainmen set the emergency brakes from the rear cars. At gunpoint, he marched the conductor through the train and into the locomotive cab. There, he ordered the engineer to get the train moving again. When the crew refused, Frenette attempted to rob them, but curiously, he declined to take the engineer's watch. The gunman then jumped from the train and fled into the Canadian countryside. What followed was one of the largest manhunts the region had seen. Police officers and armed citizens pursued Frenette across rural Ontario until he was cornered inside a farmhouse near Barwick. The home's occupants had been forced out at gunpoint. For hours, shots echoed from the farmhouse as Frenette challenged officers to come inside and get him. Finally, authorities set the building ablaze. As flames consumed the structure, Frenette ran from the house and was immediately shot by officers. Even then, that handcuff still hung from his wrist. Before he died from his gunshot wounds, Frenette reportedly told investigators that he had become desperate after losing both his job and his girlfriend. He expressed regret for the killings, claiming he had heard that American officers were quick to shoot. Back in Minnesota, an even more heartbreaking tragedy was unfolding. While Laurence Doten's murder shocked communities across both Minnesota and Ontario, perhaps no one carried a heavier burden than his wife, Clara. You see, Clara was fighting a battle of her own. Clara had tuberculosis. She'd been struggling with it for a few years, and while Laurence was working up north, the disease got worse, and Clara ended up being sent to live as a patient at the Mineral Springs Sanitarium in Cannon Falls. That's actually where Dolores was born. Judy Wilson is Dolores's fourth of 6 children.
When he was up north working, she had gotten bad again, and so she was in the sanitarium, and they took her out to give birth and then put her back in, and she never even got to hold Mom. And she stayed in the sanitarium, and then after he died, they said that she couldn't be with her kids, and she just gave up.
A few short months later, Clara passed away from tuberculosis. In the span of less than a year, 2 young children had lost both of their parents. 5-year-old son Theodore would eventually be sent to live with his maternal grandmother. When Ted grew up and finished high school, he decided to join the Navy.
He joined the Navy, and he was in the Pacific Theater. He was on an aircraft carrier escort ship, the Fanshawe Bay, which is named after a bay in Alaska. And he was a radio technician, and he received the call that the Japanese had surrendered and got to share that news with his commanding officer. And he was involved in the Battle of Leyte in the Philippines. And he said that had it not been for a storm at sea, the Japanese would have probably sunk their ship.
Ted unknowingly followed in his father's footsteps, with both serving in world wars and both serving on the railroad. Again, following in his father's footsteps, Ted's work with the railroad would take him to several depots in both Minnesota and Nebraska. Ted and his wife would have 5 kids, raising them primarily in Nebraska, Roland the second to the youngest. After Ted's railroad career, he would continue using his radio electronics background in various jobs, including a family TV business where Roland and his brother also worked and helped. Ted's main hobby over the years was amateur radio. His call letters proudly displayed on his license plates, K0JXT. It was a hobby that gave him the opportunity to talk to people around the world. Having grown up with his maternal grandmother, Ted was not raised around the Doten side of the family, so it's hard to say how much he really knew about his parents. If he did, he didn't share really anything with his kids. Surprisingly, Roland didn't really learn any of the details about his grandfather being murdered until he was 64 years old.
I didn't know anything about my grandpa and grandma until Border Guard Bob showed up in Norfolk. Or actually, he called first. He called the vet's home where I was working and asked if I was the son of Theodore Doten and was he really living there. And he called. He thought he was in a rest home in Virginia, Norfolk, Virginia. And he was surprised that it was Nebraska. And then he said, well, Nebraska's close enough. I'm going to come down and visit him.
Border Guard Bob, that Roland is referring to, is Bob Tuttle, who at the time was serving at the War Road, Minnesota station.
So there had been rumors of two border officials, really not sure if they were Canadian, if they were U.S. Every once in a while you'd hear rumors of them being murdered on a train line. And I guess I finally just had time to dig into it a little bit more and to find out that it was factual. And then to find out the names, find out the individuals, found out the agency they belonged to, and then it kind of became, how are we going to find any family members?
Bob's simple goal was to properly honor Laurence locally in Minnesota for his service and his sacrifice.
That was my next step, was we wanted to memorialize these two gentlemen properly here locally, and started digging around, and really I just went into Google and I put Doten in and started doing some searching around, and there had been a 90th birthday party for Ted Doten in Norfolk, Nebraska, and I don't think I even really had a hunch other than the last name, and I ended up calling there, introducing myself. I did it through official channels and trying to bring a little bit of credibility to myself to a stranger on a phone, and secretary or whomever answered and said, well, yeah, Ted is still living, because the newspaper article was a few years old. So they did tell me that, and they did say that his son Roland worked at the facility and that they would have Roland give me a shout back. So Roland did. And I got telling him the story, and he says, yes. He didn't know much, but I pretty much knew I had the right family. I was able to get my agency to allow me to drive down and introduce myself to Ted and Roland and spend some time with him, and actually was able to get down another time before Ted passed away. So
Bob then invited Roland to Minnesota.
Roland then did come up here and stay with me for a couple days, and we kind of toured the train line on the Ontario. The two men were killed in Ontario. The train line kind of skipped across onto the Canadian side, and so we kind of took a trip. We stopped, talked to some locals. We found out where the old train depot was. And the train depot had been moved off the tracks years ago, but they told us where it was, so we were able to go out in the country, locate it, and take a few pictures there. Yeah, so it was pretty neat.
Bob's efforts, not as a family member, but just as someone who served and recognizes the importance of remembering and honoring our fallen heroes, was instrumental in making sure Laurence was properly recognized at the Border Patrol Station in Minnesota, where Bob retired as their agent in charge in 2020 after 28 years of service. Sadly, Roland learned from his father that he only had one memory of his parents.
His mom was in a sanitarium in Cannon Falls, and he does remember going to that sanitarium and standing in the parking lot and waving at her from, I don't know, the third or fourth floor window or something like that. And that's the only recollection he had of his mother.
Judy remembers learning early on about her grandparents from her mother, Dolores, who was Ted's only sibling, and just a few months old when her mother passed. While Ted was sent to live with his mother's grandmother, Dolores was sent to be raised by her paternal grandparents, which would be Lawrence's side of the family.
When she was a year old, my grandpa bought a house in Stewartville and raised her there. And she was very musically inclined and became she became really good playing the piano, and she was like the area piano instructor for years. And all my life, we would walk from the elementary school in Stewartville to Auntie's house, and she'd give piano lessons and then take us out to the farm by Racine. She was kind of known as the local piano teacher. And before she got married, she had 75 students. Their grandparents finally told her, well, that's about enough. You need to cut them like in half. Because they were elderly, and I'm sure that was just a little too much.
Dolores would eventually marry the love of her life, Donald William Nearing. And they would start off in Stewartville farming and eventually move to Oregon, where they raised their 6 children. Judy was number 4. Most people remember Laurence Doten for the sacrifice he made as a United States immigration inspector, murdered in the line of duty aboard a Canadian National Railway passenger train in 1930. His sacrifice as a federal law enforcement officer has never been forgotten and has been honored since 1936, when the U.S. approved a memorial be created and dedicated to the 29 officers of the Immigration and Naturalization Service and the Immigration Border Patrol who died in the line of duty. Laurence Edward Doten was number 24. What many didn't know was that years before he patrolled the Canadian border, Laurence had already served his nation in another uniform during World War I, serving with Company L of the 101st Infantry Regiment. As we shared with you earlier in the story, on October 10, 1918, Laurence was wounded when a German machine gun bullet struck him in the left shoulder during combat. Like countless American soldiers, he carried the scars of war home with him after returning from France. However, for decades, most of that chapter of his life had faded into history. Over 80 years after Laurence's death, family members were looking through some of Dolores's old paperwork and documents being stored in Judy's brother's attic, and they discovered Laurence's military service records and more.
My mom had a tin box from grandparents, and all his papers were in it. And most of his letters home were in it, and letters from up north. And so we started reading through. We learned so much about him through this whole process, because I'd never read those letters. And there were even some from his grandfather that he wrote home during the Civil War. He was a prisoner of the South. Yeah. So we learned a lot about him too during this whole thing. When they were going through it, they came across this picture, and it was shades of black and gray. And my nephew came across it leaning against the wall up there and brought it down and didn't know what it was. And it had a picture of a statue woman anointing a soldier, and it had Woodrow Wilson's signature and my grandpa's name on it. And I remembered it from hanging at the grandparents' house where my mom was raised. It hung in the bedroom, and I didn't know what it was because I was a kid. So anyway, my oldest brother, he started looking into it and asking some of the older folks at church and stuff. And apparently they weren't giving out Purple Hearts anymore during that time. And so that's what they would give to injured soldiers. And it was, I think they called her Lady Columbia. So one of the gentlemen at church told my brother that they had reinstituted the Purple Heart in 35. And if he'd have still been alive, he could have applied for one and would have had a Purple Heart. And so my brother and I went down to, the Veterans Affairs people down in Tillamook County, and took it down there and asked him about it. And he was all excited to see it. And he was even more excited about some of the battles that my grandfather was involved in on the front lines in France, were pretty important battles. And he took a big interest and helped us get the Purple Heart.
Nearly a century after Laurence was wounded in France, and more than 8 decades after he was killed in the line of duty, Laurence Doten's military service would finally be recognized with a surprise Purple Heart ceremony and presentation to his daughter Dolores on Memorial Day in 2013.
My mom was 83 at the time, and she was getting dementia. So I'm not sure she really completely knew what was going on. If we'd have been able to do it earlier, I think she would have. But when we drove into the grounds, there was a reader board, electronic reader board, and it said Purple Heart Ceremony for Laurence Doten. And she looked at it and she said, "That's my dad."
This was a very fitting tribute to a man who had answered his country's call not once, but twice. First, as a soldier in World War I, and later as a federal officer protecting the United States border. Now, this story also takes a bit of a turn when the family of the man who shot and killed Laurence reached out to the Doten family.
This woman in Canada, she'd been doing some family history stuff and came across the article where her uncle had murdered my grandfather. And she knew nothing about it. And she said they would go and stay with her grandparents, his parents, and no one ever mentioned it other than he was killed and it had something to do with the train. So we got to know his family. She said that there was a lot of like bipolar disorder in the family, and she wondered if it had something to do with that, what happened when he snapped and did that. So then she got a hold of a cousin, and he reached out to me, and then he became friends with Raleigh. And so I was talking with him on the phone one day, and he gave me the creeps at first because when he asked where I lived and I told him Nehalem, Oregon, he got quiet, and then he said, my brother lives there. So my husband goes and gets the phone book real quick and looks, and sure enough, he's in the phone book. And I met him one day, but I worked at City Hall in our little town, Manzanita, and helped out at the police station and everything, you know, and friends with all our little cops and just a little town. And anyway, so one day he came in to pay his water bill, and I was just so quiet because it was like, holy moly, you know. My mom could have stood next to him in the grocery store and not known that she was that close to the family that killed her dad and changed the course of that whole family history.
To the credit of the Doten family, they embraced the Frenette family and have maintained a friendship with them ever since. To the credit of the Frenette family, that wasn't the first time they'd reached out.
When it happened, my mom said that his name was Emmerich Frenet, and his mother reached out to my great-grandparents and to his wife and apologized on behalf of the family. They felt so bad about it.
Laurence Edward Doten. His story is a powerful reminder that every line of duty death leaves far more than a name etched in stone. It leaves a family whose lives were forever altered. It also leaves behind a legacy of courage, sacrifice, and service. One that deserves to be remembered, to be honored, and to be passed on to future generations.
It's very important. And what I've discovered, years later is how important his story is to his nieces and nephews too, because they grew up hearing about him from their grandparents and how beloved he was. And so that's been really heartwarming for me to know that he has, lived on in all of their lives. Yeah, and remembered, for his sake and for the sake of their grandparents, his siblings. And, it's just, it's very touching. Very touching.
Lawrence's partner who was killed, Inspector Laurence Jones, was just 27 years old. Laurence Doten was just 34 years old when he was killed. His wife was just 30 when she died a few months later. Laurence and Clara are buried next to each other in Holden Lutheran Cemetery in Kenyon, Minnesota. It's important that we remember heroes like Laurence Doten, not for just how they died, but for how they lived. These men and women answered a calling that few are willing to accept. They chose a life of service, believing that the safety and well-being of others was worth their own sacrifice. They put service before self, stepping forward where others stepped back, running towards danger when everyone else was running away. They did so not for recognition or reward, but because they believed in something bigger than themselves, their communities, their country, their neighbors, and the promise of making the world a little safer for the people they loved. When a hero is lost in the line of duty, the sacrifice doesn't end with them. It never does. It's carried forward every day by the families they leave behind, the spouses, the children, parents, siblings, friends, and co-workers whose lives are forever changed. That is why we tell these stories. That is why we remember. That's why we have to support the survivor families who carry the memory of these heroes forward. Laurence answered his country's call not once, but twice. First, as a soldier on the battlefields of France, and later, as a United States immigration inspector along the Canadian border. His service is over. Our duty to remember is not. We encourage you to check out Laurence Doten's memorial page on our website. The link is in the show notes. There, the family has shared many photos of Laurence, the family, his Purple Heart, a picture of Dolores being presented the Purple Heart, and many more. By looking at the pictures, by listening to his story, and by sharing it with others, we can all help ensure Laurence Edward Doten's service and sacrifice is never forgotten.
Walking eastbound. Services need assistance.
Shots fired. Officer down.
Thank you for spending the time to listen, learn about, and honor the memory of this fallen hero. Make sure you take the time to thank your local law enforcement for their service and their sacrifice. And don't forget to thank their families too. They also sacrifice so much for our safety. It's up to us to help ensure the sacrifices made by these fallen heroes and by their families are never forgotten. So please share this podcast with family and friends. Until next time, this is the Officer Down Memorial Podcast. I'm Scott Rose. Thanks for listening.